It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 118. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, I will be discussing a mixed styles contest between the original Trustbuster, Marin Plestina, and Taro Miyake, a Jiu-Jitsu black belt, in 1920. But first, I wanted to start off the show by saying I caught up on some modern wrestling over the last couple weeks, and I'm up to date on both the WWE and AEW. WWE was setting up the Survivor Series, and I must say, I noticed right away that Brock Lesnar and Minoru Suzuki are now sharing the same barber. Well, I'm not quite sure that the hillbilly samurai look really suits Brock. I guess when you're that tough, you can wear your hair however you'd like. But I found the lead up to Survivor Series pretty standard, and I'm starting to realize something with WWE and AEW. In WWE, a lot of times you can skip the wrestling matches because they all look the same. I think this what we're seeing is the developmental system that they have in place tends to make all the wrestlers look and wrestle the same. Maybe not their physical look. Obviously, they all costume differently and think, but I'm talking about in ring work starts to all look pretty similar. So when you have someone that kind of stands out, like a Gunther on the side of physicality, or a Javon Evans who does a lot of the high flying things that other people do, but does it very, very well and does some unique things, they tend to stand out. But in WWE, you can skip a lot of the wrestling and just go to the interviews with like a CM Punk. This kind of reminds me of the old AWA program of the 1980s. You never wanted to watch any of the matches just because they were boring, but the interviews were golden on AWA. They did have one really good match, and so when I caught up on Raw, I had not watched Raw since either the end of September or the first week in October, so I had quite a few episodes to skim through, but since I can do an episode in 30 minutes or less, it didn't take me that long to get caught up because I did want to get up to the match between CM Punk and Braun Breaker over the World Championship. I think that this match overall was good, but there were a couple of things in there that I shook my head over, and one was they're having this really great hard-hitting match, and Punk goes to do one of those suicide dives out of the ring, and Breaker kind of catches him with a forearm, and that landing looked pretty hard that CM Punk took, but they end up where Punk is now out on the table. And of course, Breaker has to climb up to the top rope, come off the top rope to the outside to drive Punk through the table. And then a minute to 30 seconds after that spot, CM Punk gets the win over Breaker. I question why that spot was even necessary. And if I have the future of the company going against my biggest star in the company at the time, I would be ticked off that they're taking these unnecessary risks that people see every single week on every single show. Just about every single week, someone goes through a table in WWE, and just about every match nearly in AEW, someone goes through a table. So the spot is worthless. It's nothing new. People have seen it a million times. And why are you letting your biggest star do this and your future? And you have a move that has such a high risk of injury. Maybe not necessarily rate of injury, but a high risk of injury. Overall, though, it was a good match. Probably the best WWE match I've seen in a while. And I can't say that it was better than the promos and the packages leading up to it, but the promos and the packages leading up to it were excellent. Then when we get to AEW, I had said in the past few weeks that one of the best matches I've seen in all of 2025 was Jon Moxley versus Josh Alexander in one of those Continental Classic matches. I'm going to follow that up by saying that Jon Moxley versus Shelton Benjamin on AEW was not. It was probably as good as that match, and it was the best match on the show that night. As a matter of fact, you could have turned the show off after that match and not missed a thing because they had some garbage match main event to end it, which was Hook and Powerhouse Hobbs versus Hangman Adam Page and Swerve Strickland. And I skipped ahead to see who won, and who won I figured was who was going to win. But there's all this garbage in the ring, and that's why I skipped it. As soon as I heard lights out match, garbage wrestling, had no interest in it. Then a few nights later, I think this was on Collision, but I could be wrong. This could be Dynamite too. But it's what I thought could have been a great match, but for one real obvious botch, and then one move again. I have no idea why anyone would want to take this move because it didn't lead to the end of the match or a hospitalization. It just was a move in the middle of this match. When you have Darby Allin, who was taking on Pac, you know you're going to have some high flying, some big bumps, some gravity defying things, and they do it very well. Darby Allin has a unique charisma, and he looks athletic enough that I think he should be promoted as one of AEW's big stars. I think Pac has been terribly misused and should have been a realistic, but he never a realistic heel, but he never beats anybody. He's always losing his matches. But in this match, they were having the typical match you would expect for the two of them. And they go outside the ring, and Pac pulls the steps over. And I know this had to be Darby's idea because I don't think Pac would have on his own said, I'm going to give this guy this bump. And Pac basically does a release suplex over his head and lands Darby as flat as you can land someone on a set of steps, would have those jutting steps on them, and plants Darby in the middle of these steps with, of course, his feet above his head. And Darby hits the steps as flat as you can hit steps and slides down, which, of course, there's no way that step didn't hit him on the spine. So he's going with one of the most fragile parts of his body onto these steel steps. And even though Pac is the right guy to get you over there as flat as you can be put on those things, that is a ridiculous bump to take in a television match that's going to take years off your career. Dynamite Kid used to do amazing things, and everybody said he'll be in a wheelchair by the time he's 40, and he was in a wheelchair before he was 40. I could see the same thing happening to Darby because of all these crazy bumps that he takes time after time. He is a lighter guy, but that doesn't matter. You're still hitting things that don't give. You're still letting people toss you around and hope that you have someone there that's going to take care of you. In this case, he was as well as he could have been taken care of. I just don't think that that was a bump that was needed to be taken. And then the thing that really was a botch or a screw up, Pac is selling his left ankle that he had injured in a previous match. He starts to have an issue with the ankle. And I think if you go back at his injury history, he has had legitimate ankle injuries before. I think that's what derailed him in WWE for like a year. He starts selling the ankle injury. They have this exchange. Darby gets a chair while the referee, distracted, knocked out, doesn't care. And he starts to put it on the right ankle, which Pac has been selling the left ankle. So Pac kind of leans up and says, and starts to pull his foot out, trying to tell him wrong ankle, and feeds him the left ankle for him to put it on the chair, which everybody in the world on national television and in that arena that night saw. And yes, everybody knows that this is prearranged, but it's just like violating the laws of entertainment. It takes you out of it when you see something like that where they're like, no, 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 you got the wrong. He would have been better off just coming off on the right ankle and saying, yeah, I knew the other ankle was bad, but I was going to break both his ankles, than to do what they did, which exposed to everybody that Darby had screwed up. That took me out of the match. And so that took what I thought could have been a very good match and just made it into a so okay match. And the only other thing I noticed on AEW, I watched the Saturday Night's Dynamite on January 17th, not Dynamite, Collision, the Saturday Night Collision live on January 17th, and I'm not watching them live anymore. I'm going to watch everything after the show is over, because I discovered that if with AEW, if you skip over all their interview segments and all their backstage segments and everything that's not the wrestling match, the show is much more enjoyable, because most of the interview segments and that all comes across as very, very juvenile, childish. But if you watch the wrestling matches, you can enjoy a lot of them. Not the garbage wrestling, of course, and not everything, but I found most of the matches are much more enjoyable if you just skip all the interviews in that. At the end of the match, where Powerhouse Hobbs is going to go to WWE, it looks like. His contract is up with AEW, so this was one of his last matches in the company. So you knew that the Trios title was going to go over to Hangman Adam Page and Jet Speed. Towards the end of that match, where they're setting up the spot where they're going to do the finish, Speedball Mike Bailey does a jump on the apron to land on Will Hobbs and lands bigger than anything with at least one and probably both of his knees right on Hobbs's face. And you could tell Hobbs was shocked. The good thing is Bailey probably only weighs about 170 pounds. So fortunately, it's not a 250 pounder coming down with her knee on your face, but still 170 pounds. I know it couldn't have felt good, and he definitely looked shocked that he got hit. And then they went into the finish. Didn't look like it did any real damage to him, and he'll probably be off to WWE, and a guy built like him they can really use. Some of the botches these guys do, it's because of the high risk maneuvers that they are doing, to quote Jim Ross, that are high risk to them and high risk to their opponent. And the fans have seen this stuff a million times, so it's not like you're going to get that huge of a pop off these things that you're doing. As I've said before, I'm not going to focus a lot on modern wrestling anymore, but every once in a while, particularly if there's a news story or something that we do cover, I will review some of the newer wrestling, and I will also review things from the 50s up to the 80s. This week's history topic, I wanted to focus on a mixed contest that I had just found. I didn't even know these two wrestled, and I didn't know that they wrestled a mixed contest. I do think this is actually a contest. Taro Miyake wrestled a lot of worked, or grappled, because he was usually the jiu-jitsu competitor. Grappled in a lot of worked contests. Well, they weren't contests if they were worked. And a lot of worked exhibitions over the years. And this is not uncommon in a lot of the judo and jiu-jitsu black belts that went around the world to spread judo and jiu-jitsu. It was almost impossible then, it's almost impossible now, for a martial arts instructor to make a full-time living from instructing martial arts. I've known a few that have, but they're few and far between. And they're usually pretty sharp business people that maybe create after-school programs. So they're offering a babysitting service with martial arts instruction, or they just have a ton of students like Henzo Gracie up in New York. I think he's got like 600 jiu-jitsu students. But for the most part, martial arts instructors throughout history have had a very difficult time making a full-time living from just teaching the martial arts. And a lot of these judo and jiu-jitsu black belts supplemented their income by taking part in challenge matches or professional wrestling matches or mixed styles matches with professional wrestlers. And a lot of the times they worked those matches with the wrestlers. One of the few people that never took part in a worked match was Elio Gracie. His brother George, the Red Cat, who was the family champion before him, had wrestled a number of professional wrestlers in challenge matches, but George has said that he worked some of those matches. He said Elio, though, who he didn't always get along with, never worked any of the matches. But a lot of the judo and jiu-jitsu black belts did. I went into this match because it was 1920, thinking, well, they might have worked this, but it could have been a contest because Marin Plestina around this time was challenging the Wrestling Trust and was primarily taking part in legitimate contests because he was trying to stay sharp if he could ever get one of the big four into the wrestling ring. In early 1917, before Joe Stecker lost his world title to Earl Caddock, Marin Plestina had had a legitimate contest with Joe Stecker for the world title. Plestina came out of that match, even though Stecker beat him. Stecker, I think, took one fall out of a 2 out of 3 falls match. And because so much time had expired, because as a lot of contests are, they're long, boring, and inconclusive, Stecker was declared the winner by the referee, which set Plestina off. And it set Plestina off to the point where he exposed to the newspapers that many of the wrestlers worked their matches and that there was a wrestling trust that controlled professional wrestling. And it was Jack Curley and a handful of other promoters starting up around the country. Well, this ticked off Jack Curley. So Jack Curley basically froze Plestina out of any big money wrestling matches from 1917 to 1921. Plestina was able to get a few matches each year, and all of those matches were contests for the most part because he was trying to stay sharp in case he ever got a match with the 4 wrestlers that he had challenged, which were Joe Stecker, Earl Caddock, Ed Strangler Lewis, and Vladek Zabisco. Miyake, by this point in time, is definitely taking part in worked wrestling matches. Miyake has also had a number of legitimate contests with professional wrestlers, including a legitimate contest with Ad Santel in 1916. Always the trick between these jiu-jitsu and wrestling matches is to come up with a rule set that doesn't favor one person's style over the other. And so there's always an argument of rules. They settle on the rules for this match. It will be a series of rounds, 20-minute rounds, with a 10-minute rest between each round. And this is supposed to be to a finish, and it's at best 2 out of 3 falls. The first fall starts, and so Marin Plestina is much bigger than Taro Miyake. Marin Plestina is about 6'1" and weighs between 235 and 245 pounds. Taro Miyake is 5'8" and 175 to 180 pounds. He's stocky, but he's short. For the most part, Plestina is able to throw Miyake to the mat, but when he follows him down, he keeps getting caught in Miyake's guard. So Miyake does try to throw him a couple times. Write-ups on the matches do not say that Miyake wore the gi for this match, but I would be shocked if he didn't, because every other mixed contest Miyake has been in, he's wore the jiu-jitsu gi into the ring to take part in that match. So my belief is that he was wearing the gi, and he was using it to try to help trip Plestina or grab him in a choke. He was not able to do either, and Plestina is usually able to power Miyake to the mat. Well, as soon as they hit the mat, Miyake secures a guard, and they just are stuck in this position. The only real offense that they're able to get is Plestina does get a hold of Miyake's toes a couple times and tries to put him in a toe hold, but he never is able to really secure it. Miyake is able to slip his foot out each time. Other than that, the only offense in this match is Miyake and Plestina trying to bounce the other one's head off the mat. Because Plestina is usually in the top position, he is able to take Miyake's head and bounce it off the mat like a basketball. Miyake is not nearly as successful because he's grabbing Plestina by the hair and trying to pull him at a downward angle over to the side of his body to bang it into the mat. So, of course, he's not at a great angle. He doesn't have a whole lot of leverage, and he can't exert enough force to really do any serious damage by banging Plestina's head into the mat. Plestina, however, is able to bang Miyake's head into the mat quite a bit. This is not enough, though, to put Miyake in a bad position to get a hook. So they go through this for the first round, the second round, and the third round. And the crowd is starting to get a little restless because they were really into it during the first round. After that, it's just a repeat of the same thing. Plestina takes him down. Plestina tries for a toe hold. Miyake slips out of the toe hold. They're both laying on the mat. So Plestina does the only thing he can do, which is bang Miyake's head into the floor. Eventually, either the organizer or the referee in charge makes the determination after the third round that we're going to go one more round, and if there's no fall scored, this is going to be a draw. After a 10-minute rest, they come back out, and it's the same as it was before, only Plestina's not even really trying for a toe hold too much, figuring that, we'll just take a draw and move on because neither one of us is getting anything done here. And that is basically how the match ends. At the end of that fourth round, the referee declares the match a draw. I expected the fans to be quite hot about that and possibly near riot levels, but they just kind of accepted that it was a draw. The match itself took place in Spokane, Washington. Crowd never became riotous, and the match ended with both men shaking hands and walking out of the ring together, which is a lot of times the best you can hope for in an anticlimactic match like that. Sometimes the fans felt like they were ripped off and they would get very angry, but I guess the first round was novel enough and entertaining enough that even though it was inconclusive, they weren't all that angry about it. And I have a tendency to focus on long, boring, and inconclusive, but it's always boring and inconclusive more than long. A lot of times matches would go long because they were bidding up the gambling. A lot of times when people were working prior to the development of the promotional system, the reason they were working was to get the most gambling winnings they could on a match because they didn't just bet on the outcome. They would bet on first fall, quickest fall. And after the gamblers would be working the crowd, the bookies in effect, taking bets in that, they knew where the odds were and how they were going to make the most money. No surprise, whoever was going to make the most money by getting the first fall, that's who got the first fall. Whoever was going to make the most money by getting the quickest fall, that's how they got the quickest fall. And then usually the winner was going to be the winner. Sometimes they would even manipulate that. And then they would divide those gambling winnings in half between the two of them. Plestina would finally get his match, but it wasn't with one of the big four. He wrestled John the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesek in November of 1921 in a very controversial match that got Pesek banned from New York for life, which turned out to be almost 8 years. Taro Miyake would continue on and continue to be involved in professional wrestling. He would do mixed contests every once in a while when people wanted to generate interest, but he wasn't having a whole lot of mixed contests that were legitimate after this one. At the time of this match, he was 40 years old already, and he would die in 1935 at only 55 years of age. But Miyake was active in professional wrestling up almost until his death in 1935. He was a fairly well used attraction in St. Louis during the early days of that promotion. The person who helped build the St. Louis promotion in the 1920s was Jim Londas, but a frequent participant on the cards was also Taro Miyake. My recommendations for this week is a book that I've been reading for the last couple of weeks on Kindle called The Wrestling Archive, and it's a book that Scott Teal put out that is interviews of a number of professional wrestlers from 50s, 60s, 70s, some 80s. One of the probably the longest interview and one of the most interesting is on Buddy Colt. But I also read an interview by a gentleman by the name of Dick Cardinal, and there are a couple of videos on YouTube of him teaching some wrestling. I'll probably put a link to one of those videos at kenzermanjr.com/episode 118, as well as a link for this book. But Dick Cardinal was trained for wrestling by August Sepp, who was a wrestler in the 19 teens and 1920s. He was originally from Estonia, and he was a promoter of athletic shows in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, early 60s. And he died in 62. But Sepp didn't know how to work. So most of his matches are supposedly contests. I'm going to research that and see if I agree. But a lot of the ones that I've looked at so far, it does look like he was shooting. And he was a hooker, and he taught Cardinal how to hook. And so Cardinal had a short pro wrestling career in the Pacific Northwest outside of the athletic shows, but he was primarily a athletic show wrestler. And they worked matches at the at shows too, as he described, as they tried to get people interested to come up and try their luck with the pros. But he said there was a lot of pressure when you were a carnival wrestler because when you were taking on all comers, August Sepp, it was winner takes all. So if some schlub from the neighborhood came out and beat the wrestler, August Sepp paid off the local wrestler and then he fired the guy that lost him the money. So he said there was always a lot of pressure. And Cardinal, in his prime, was between 175 and 180 pounds. He was the smaller guy that Sepp would use to try to bait these town toughs into coming in and taking on one of his wrestlers. Because even though he was smaller, Cardinal was a heck of a hooker and he could sub the guys pretty quick. And he said he didn't mess around. When he was wrestling somebody legitimate in the at shows, he would immediately go for a hook and hook them because he said he wasn't going to take any chance of losing the money and getting August Sepp mad at him. Lots of good interviews in there. One thing I didn't realize was the wrestler Gene Lewis, who was the kayfabe brother of Olympic wrestler Dale Lewis, had a brief stint with Central. Well, I don't know if it was a brief stint. He probably had several stints with Central States, but he had a stint with Central States in 1981, and I had actually seen him on a couple of Wrestling at the Chase cards. I just didn't know who he was. His is one of the more interesting interviews, too. So I highly recommend The Wrestling Archive. This is the first one. I think there's a couple of them that Scott Teal put out, but it's a very good book. As far as television shows, I haven't watched anything that new recently. I will recommend Still Open All Hours, which is a sequel to the original series Open All Hours that starred Ronnie Barker and David Jason. Well, the Still Open All Hours is the nephew, now Granville, and his son Leroy running Arkwright's store. And I find that one more endearing than the original. The original is hilarious as well, but the relationship between the father and the son is a lot stronger and draws you in more than the kind of antagonistic, combative relationship between Arkwright and Granville in the first series. So still open all hours. It's available on Amazon Prime if you have BritBox, which I do. My review for this week is going to be a WCW show from 1992. And I actually thought it was a show that I had remembered that was really bad. It's actually better than I remembered it being. I watched this because it had recently been released on WCW, the WWE channel on YouTube. And I remembered Battle Bowl being horrible, but I was thinking of the first Battle Bowl in 1991. This is the second iteration of Battle Bowl, the Lethal Lottery 2. And they did it differently than they did in 91, which made it a little bit more palatable. So the Battle Bowl matches, actually, there was only 4 of them. 91, the whole thing was Battle Bowl, and it was a terrible card. It, or the 1989 tournament, Starcade, I think may have been the worst I ever saw. I know 90 is, in a lot of people's hearts, one of the worst because that's where Ric Flair was the Black Scorpion. I actually was at that card live because it was in St. Louis. Me and my friend James went to see that pay-per-view in St. Louis live, and it was not as bad in the arena as it looked on television. They had not put out a good Starcade in quite a while, and this one is not a great Starcade. One day in the future, I will review Starcade 1993, which was the Ric Flair's career versus Vader's world title, which I think was done very well. And that is one of the best Starcades of the 90s, in my opinion. And it was the first really good Starcade they had had since, I don't know, 86, 87, 88. A lot of people don't like WCW 1987, but there were still a lot of great wrestlers there. And Flair Garvin was a compelling storyline. I know that Garvin didn't like the way he was treated, but it was a compelling storyline. So just to go quickly over, the first 4 matches were lethal lottery matches. There was a match that was not on the show where Brad Armstrong defeated Shanghai Pierce in a singles match, which was probably good for what it was. Then the first lethal lottery tag match was Van Hammer and Danny Spivey, and I did not realize that Danny Spivey trained Van Hammer for wrestling, but Van Hammer was so stiff. And they defeated Johnny B. Bad and Cactus Jack. Johnny B. Bad goes for a Hurricanrana at one point on Van Hammer, and Van Hammer goes face first right into the mat. He's lucky he didn't spike on his head and break his neck. Then Big Van Vader and Dustin Rhodes, who Vader had just injured, defeated Kensuke Sasaki and the Barbarian. And then after the match, of course, Vader clotheslines Dustin. Then the Great Muta and Barry Windham defeated Brian Pillman and Too Cold Scorpio. And the final lethal lottery match was Steve Williams and the winner from the year before, Sting, defeating Jushin Thunder Liger and Eric Watts. Eric Watts was in the position he was in because Bill Watts was booking and the vice president at the time. But the interesting thing here was Steve Williams and Sting beat Jushin Thunder Liger like he owed him money, but then they pinned Eric Watts. And I think it was Doc that pinned Eric Watts. So even though they were giving him that big push, he's the one that did the honors in that match. Then they had a really good singles match for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, which had almost no heat with the crowd whatsoever because they knew Muta and they were cheering for Muta, but they really weren't familiar with Masahiro Chono unless they were a Smart fan. This crowd at the time were not made up of a lot of Smart fans, so they were kind of sitting on their hands. And then you had Ron Simmons defeat Steve Williams by disqualification. I found this match to be kind of a letdown. I was looking forward to it going in, but I don't think Bill Watts wanted to really have either one of them lose, so I don't know why they booked the match in the first place, because it was kind of a flat match that really didn't help advance Ron Simmons as world champion, and it didn't do much for Doc either. And then the last 3 matches were the big matches on the card. The first was Shane Douglas and Ricky Steamboat defeating Barry Windham and Brian Pillman. Douglas and Steamboat made a very good tag team. Wyndham and Pillman are two of the best wrestlers at the time, but I think Pillman made a much better tag team with Steve Austin. And in the upcoming months, Austin and Pillman are going to wrestle Steamboat and Shane Douglas, and those are some of the best tag matches that I ever saw. Sting defeats Big Van Vader in the King of Cable tournament final. I think Vader was Sting's best opponent. He always made Sting look, well, I don't know if he always made Sting, maybe Sting made him look, but they didn't have a styles clash. So the two of them worked really well together, and their matches were always very enjoyable. And then the final match was the Battle Bowl, which was very, you could ignore it. It was nothing great. The Great Muta won by last eliminating Barry Windham. And I think the plan was to make Muta a big baby face because Jim Ross had suggested that in the past. And now with Bill Watts in charge, I think that they were going to go that way. But I think Muta went back to Japan not long after that. So that kind of squashed him being the big baby face in the company. That's it for this week's episode. Next week, I'm definitely going to cover two things. One, I'm going to give my thoughts on the first UFC card on Paramount. And I'm also going to talk about Harry Hill, who was he was a collar and elbow wrestler himself, but he was the brains behind the working group that was working collar and elbow wrestling matches in the late 1860s and through most of the 1870s. And besides being involved with professional wrestling as an organizer, he was often the referee for those matches. And how Hill got to know Homer Lane was Hill beat Homer Lane in a legitimate contest in 1867 and then kind of took Lane under his wing, and Lane became one of his top collar and elbow wrestlers. And Lane won some contests, but they did a lot of working. Harry Hill was also known as being particularly honest, and so he was often the person that would hold the stake or the purse in some of the biggest professional prize fights of the 1870s. So when Joe Goss fought Jem Mace, Harry Hill was the person that held the purse for that match, or that bout. And they said that Harry Hill, no matter how much money he was holding, and sometimes it could be as high as $10,000, $20,000, even higher, every single dime was always accounted for when he handed that purse to whoever the winner was. For that reason, he was almost always the person that was the stakeholder in those big prize fights throughout the 1870s. So we'll talk about Harry Hill in next week's episode. I think that's it for this week. If you would like to check out the show notes for this episode, they're available at kenzermanjr.com/episode 118. I would also like to ask you to rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. That helps keep the podcast visible and helps people that have not discovered it find it. And you can always reach out to me with a question at ken@kenzermanjr.com. And until next week, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.